to forget that the Apostle Paul and the rest of the early followers of the way of Jesus were still working it out. They didn't have our benefit of 2,000 years of church history and experience and countless theologians and philosophers and mystics. All they had was the life of Jesus at this point, some 30 years on from his crucifixion. So they were all, in some respects, putting it together as they went along, trying as best they could to wrap their hearts and minds around this indescribable experience of divinity and humanity coming together in Jesus. Even with the hindsight of 2,000 years, we are still struggling to find more complete and holistic ways to understand and put together what happened and how it relates to the basic reality of what God is, who Jesus is, and what that has to do with us and how we live. Paul is figuring it out for himself right here in 2 Corinthians. And let's be honest for a second. He is basically boasting about himself without boasting about himself by saying, I know a guy who had such an amazing experience with God 14 years ago that it can't even be described. I'll brag about that guy, but not about myself unless it's about how weak I am. But if I wanted to brag about myself, I would be well within my rights because what happened to me was true. But I don't want anyone to think more of me than they need to. Then he goes on to say that he was given a thorn in his flesh, a messenger of the accuser, just to keep him from getting a big head about himself. And at this point, I'm wondering how well it's working because it all ends up sounding like really insincere humility, trying to cover up this puffed up opinion of himself. The disciples who became apostles, and even Paul to some degree, all dealt with this issue of expecting Jesus to be something that he wasn't. They puffed him up to be powerful, to come in and level the playing field. They expected military muscle and religious leadership in order to free the Jews from Roman oppression and restore them to control. They were basically looking for strength and power, someone they could brag about because of how powerful they were. What they got in Jesus could have easily been mistaken for weakness if you were looking with eyes that weren't capable of seeing anything else. When it comes to getting along in this world, doing all the practical stuff we need to do to make a living and arrange things how we want them, to get our point across, to succeed really, we turn to strength too. Muscle, elbow grease. It's how things get done. It takes a while to learn that lesson when you're younger, and some of us learn it better than others in the long run, but it's ingrained in who we are and how we do things. I'm pretty sure it's been that way since the dawn of time. You even see it in nature, survival of the fittest, right? Natural selection. The strong survive and multiply. It's one thing to see that principle working in nature, but it's another thing to see it take hold in our personalities. It's possible for people to become addicted to power. You've probably known somebody like that. Power seems like the ultimate answer. It seems like the way to get things done. I think about the Cold War of the 70s and 80s and how we subscribed to this ideology of keeping peace through building unthinkable, destructive power and existing in a perpetual standoff where no one was willing to make the first move because any display of that power would ultimately mean the destruction of life as we knew it. Power and strength is ultimately about getting something to bend to your will. whether it's in practical ways that relate to doing work or in terms of relationships and getting the desired result from someone. Power is about making something happen. But there is another source. A source of power that flows in direct contradiction to this law of nature that operates so thoroughly in our lives and in our way of living. It's a subtle force that rarely makes itself obvious, and most of the time it operates in quiet and unnoticed ways. While it is very strong, it is almost the opposite of power that seeks to make things happen. It's something we call grace. Grace is sort of this catch-all word we use to talk about things that come from God to us, in us, that we didn't earn, but are a part of God residing in us. Joy, pleasure, delight, sweetness and kindness, loveliness. Things that can seem sometimes in short supply. Things that we didn't get through elbow grease or muscle or strength, but things that we receive like a gift. And is there anything less forceful and less about power than the act of receiving? Grace is a force of God, maybe the force of God, active in us, that sounds suspiciously like the fruits of the Spirit, the fruits of the essence of God. Ironically, Paul prays 3 times for this thorn in his flesh to be removed. This thing, whatever it is that keeps him from getting a big head, he wants gone. But God's message to Paul was this: my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. The word translated as sufficient here means to be possessed of unfailing strength. God says to Paul, my essence in you is your unfailing strength. For strength finds its fulfillment in weakness, in giving way, in receiving. What could have easily been misconstrued as weakness in the life of Jesus was the source of all power itself, manifesting in Jesus. He let go of control. He took upon himself the form of a servant, even unto death. What we see in this passage in 2 Corinthians is that God was showing Paul and showing us that the same grace, the same force that filled Jesus fills us. To follow Christ is to continually discover that truth alive in us every day. Paul says in his letter to the church in Galatia that he no longer lives, but Christ lives in him. But I don't know if we take him seriously. Sometimes I think we hear that and think it's just a cool and poetic way of saying that he tried hard to be a good person. People want to take the Bible literally until it forces them to deal with their connection to the divine. What happens when Christ lives in us? How does that change the way we think about ourselves? How does it change the way we think about others? What happens when we no longer have to worry about being good enough to make it into heaven because the King of heaven is in us? Hmm? What are you going to do now? When we wake up in the morning, before our feet hit the ground, Christ lives in us. The essence of the universe lives in us. The grace, the force of God lives in me and you and moves in us, and our being is held in God. And there's nothing left to do but receive and give that love and grace as it flows in and out of all creation, infused with the sweet, holy essence of God. So I ask you again, what are you going to do with Jesus in you? What's Jesus going to do with you? I don't know, but I can't wait to find out.